The numbers are in, and they're absolutely brutal. UConn's Final Four game against UCLA just lost 10 million viewers compared to last year's matchup with Iowa, but at the same time, the UConn game, the win that UConn had against UCLA, was down 10 million viewers from the Iowa game against UConn a season ago. So it just goes to show you the impact Caitlin Clark had. That's right, 10 million people suddenly had better things to do without Caitlin Clark on their screens. ESPN is frantically spinning this catastrophe as the third most watched semifinal since 1995, conveniently skipping over last year's ratings. Meanwhile, Diana Taurasi can't stop mentioning Clark even while she's preparing to commentate the championship. The desperation is palpable, so here we are, analyzing another set of women's basketball ratings that ESPN is desperately trying to frame as some magnificent success story. You almost have to admire their creativity in avoiding the elephant that's no longer in the room. Caitlin Clark, let's break down what actually happened with these Final Four games. UConn versus UCLA pulled in 4.1 million viewers, while South Carolina versus Texas managed 3.6 million. Not terrible numbers if this were 2022, right? ESPN certainly wants you to think so with their carefully worded press release celebrating these as the third most watched NCAA women's national semifinals since 1995. Right now, ESPN the other day released a set of figures that had everybody really looking cross-eyed and side-eyed at what it was ESPN had put out. Right, they decided to put out viewership rating numbers for 2023 versus this year, leaving a lot of people going, what the hell happened to 2024? Where's those numbers? Why are you not talking about it? What ESPN conveniently forgot to mention, last year's Iowa versus UConn semifinal with Caitlin Clark drew 14.2 million viewers. That's not a typo. We're talking about a 10.1 million viewer freefall in just 1 year. A 71% drop. The kind of ratings collapse that would have network executives jumping out of windows if this were any other sport. Well, we know why, because that doesn't fit with ESPN's narrative, and they, for whatever reason, don't want to come out and just admit the ratings are real down without Caitlin Clark. But hey, third highest since 1995. Break out the champagne. The mental gymnastics required to spin this as a win deserves an Olympic gold medal. It's like bragging that your restaurant is the third busiest it's been since 1995, while conveniently not mentioning that you just lost 7 out of every 10 customers you had last year. What makes this particularly rich is that just a few weeks ago we were bombarded with think pieces about how women's basketball would be just fine without Caitlin Clark. Assertions that the sport has many stars and women's basketball was growing before Clark and will continue growing after her. I'm not saying those statements are entirely false, but losing 10 million viewers in a year isn't exactly compelling evidence for your argument. ESPN notes that the viewership for the first round was up 43% from 2023, with an average of 257,000 people watching the first 2 days of competition. But it leaves out the record-breaking viewership from last year, where viewership averaged 469,000 in the 2024 first round. That number was boosted by a whopping 3.2 million tuning in to Caitlin Clark, and Iowa's 91-65 win over Holy Cross. And that's not the only number that's plummeted without Clark. NCAA tournament attendance dropped 30% in the early rounds compared to last year. We went from 292,456 fans attending first and second round games in 2024 to 224,972 this year. That's nearly 70,000 empty seats that were filled just 1 year ago. But the most telling part of this entire saga might be the behavior of Diana Taurasi, yes, the same Diana Taurasi who infamously told Clark that reality is coming when she entered the WNBA. Apparently reality came for the TV ratings instead. During ESPN's broadcast, Taurasi couldn't help but name-drop Clark while promoting the championship game coverage. We're going to come back on Sunday. We're here for the final. We've got Caitlin Clark joining the show. She then added with a smirk, this will be Caitlin's second time. She was a college kid back then, now we got to get professional. Caitlin's grown. Boy, Caitlin's amazing. The irony here is thicker than a basketball rulebook. After months of certain WNBA veterans seeming irritated by Clark's spotlight, they're now practically begging for her to share some of that spotlight with them. Turns out Caitlin Clark is pretty useful when you need to boost your viewership numbers. Let's be crystal clear about what we're witnessing. The biggest drop in viewership in women's basketball history coincides exactly with the departure of one player. This isn't a case of correlation doesn't equal causation. This is as direct a cause and effect relationship as you'll ever see in sports media. ESPN knows this, which explains their bizarre decision to compare this year's numbers to 2023 rather than 2024 in their press releases. It's like comparing your current salary to what you made in high school while ignoring the fact that you just took a 70% pay cut from last year. Technically accurate but deliberately misleading. Some defenders of this spin job have argued that comparing to 2024 is unfair because that year was an anomaly thanks to Clark. But that's precisely the point. Clark was the anomaly. She was the once-in-a-generation talent who transcended the sport and brought in viewers who had never watched women's basketball before. What's particularly fascinating about this situation is that South Carolina was in both Final Fours last year and this year. The common denominator in the rating difference wasn't South Carolina or UConn or the round of the tournament. It was solely the presence or absence of Caitlin Clark. The championship game between UConn and South Carolina will provide another interesting data point. Last year's title game between Iowa and South Carolina drew an astounding 18.7 million viewers, far surpassing the men's championship game. This year's final will certainly do better than the semifinals, but anyone expecting it to approach last year's numbers is living in a fantasy world. What ESPN and others struggling with this reality fail to understand is that acknowledging Clark's unique appeal doesn't diminish the rest of women's basketball. It's possible to simultaneously recognize that one, Caitlin Clark is a once-in-a-generation audience draw, and two, women's basketball is still growing overall compared to pre-Clark levels. Both of these things can be true at the same time. The Final Four ratings are still better than they were in 2022 and earlier. That's growth. But pretending there hasn't been a massive Clark-sized hole in the viewership is just denying reality. This dynamic reminds me of what happened with Tiger Woods and golf. When Tiger was in contention on Sunday, golf ratings would skyrocket. When he wasn't playing or was out of contention, they would fall back to normal levels. Did that mean golf wasn't a viable sport without Tiger? Of course not. But it did mean that Tiger brought in casual viewers who otherwise wouldn't watch. The same principle applies here. Clark attracted casual sports fans who normally wouldn't watch women's basketball. Some percentage of those viewers have likely been converted to regular women's basketball fans who will continue watching without Clark. That's a net positive for the sport, but many others were watching specifically to see Clark, and they've moved on now that she's headed to the WNBA. What's particularly amusing about this whole situation is how it's exposed the contradictions in how women's basketball has been covered. For months we've been told that focusing too much on Clark was problematic because it took attention away from other deserving players. Now that those other players have the spotlight to themselves, viewership has cratered. You can't have it both ways. The reality, and yes Diana, reality is indeed coming, is that sports are star-driven enterprises. The NBA knows this. The NFL knows this. Tennis and golf know this. Individual stars drive interest, especially among casual fans. That's not a men's sports thing or a women's sports thing. It's just how sports work. The smartest approach for women's basketball would be to embrace this reality rather than fight it. Yes, Caitlin Clark moves the needle in unprecedented ways. Use that to grow the game. Use her popularity to introduce fans to other great players. Over time, some of those fans will develop broader appreciation for the sport itself. Instead, there's been this strange resistance to acknowledging Clark's unique appeal, as if doing so somehow undermines other players or the sport itself. It doesn't. Michael Jordan made the entire NBA more popular, not less. Tom Brady brought new fans to the NFL. Serena Williams did the same for women's tennis. The attendance figures tell the same story as the TV ratings. Iowa City was the most attended site during the opening rounds last year, drawing sellout crowds totaling 28,764 fans. This year Iowa didn't host any games as a 6th seed and overall attendance dropped by 30%. Again, not exactly subtle. What makes ESPN's handling of these numbers particularly egregious is that they clearly think viewers won't notice. In the age of social media and readily available information, this level of spin doesn't just fail. It actively damages credibility. Basketball fans immediately called out the selective comparison to 2023 while skipping 2024, and ESPN became the story instead of the games themselves. One Twitter user summed it up perfectly. Way to avoid 2024. What about last year ESPN? Fake media. Another wrote, I guess we skipped 2024, an anomaly year. And a third, why did they compare it to 2023 and not 2024? What about 2024, you bloody clowns? Don't worry, we already know it was down on last year. This isn't just bad PR. It's insulting to fans' intelligence. People understand that exceptional stars drive exceptional ratings. Nobody would expect this year's numbers to match last year's Clark-fueled bonanza. But by trying to hide the comparison, ESPN created a controversy where honesty would have sparked a more nuanced conversation. The irony is that there's actually a positive story to tell here. Women's basketball is still performing better than it did in the pre-Clark era. The 4.1 million viewers for UCONN UCLA would have been considered excellent in 2022. The sport has established a new baseline of popularity that's higher than before. That's growth worth celebrating. But that narrative requires acknowledging Clark's impact first, something ESPN and others seem strangely reluctant to do. It's like they're caught between wanting to benefit from Clark's popularity while simultaneously downplaying it. Diana Taurasi's behavior perfectly encapsulates this contradiction. After her reality is coming comments seem to dismiss Clark's college dominance, she's now eagerly promoting Clark's appearance on the championship broadcast. Boy, Caitlin's amazing, she says with what appears to be newfound appreciation for the rookie who's about to join her league. This sudden enthusiasm for Clark might have something to do with ESPN and the WNBA realizing what the ratings are showing, that Clark isn't just another good player but a transformative figure for women's basketball. When Taurasi announces that Clark will join the broadcast, her tone suggests she's promoting the main attraction rather than just another guest. The language is telling. Caitlin's grown. It's a subtle acknowledgement that perhaps her previous comments about Clark were off the mark. When reality came, it wasn't Clark who needed the wake-up call, it was everyone else. This all comes back to a fundamental truth in sports. Authenticity matters. Fans can sense when they're being sold a manufactured narrative versus an honest assessment. The attempt to minimize Clark's impact while simultaneously benefiting from it feels inauthentic, and fans are noticing. What would authentic coverage look like? It would acknowledge that yes, Clark is an unprecedented ratings draw who brought millions of new eyes to the sport. It would also recognize that her impact has created a higher baseline of interest that can benefit the entire sport if leveraged correctly. It would celebrate other stars without pretending they currently have the same audience appeal as Clark. Most importantly, it would treat basketball fans like intelligent people who can handle nuance rather than consumers who need to be manipulated with selective statistics. The reality, there's that word again, is that women's basketball is in a transition period. It experienced the Caitlin Clark supernova and now it's figuring out what comes next. The worst strategy would be to pretend the supernova never happened, or that its effects weren't real. The smartest strategy would be to build on the new foundation Clark helped create. Use the increased attention to showcase other compelling players and storylines. Acknowledge that while ratings might not match the Clark peak for some time, the overall trajectory can still be upward if handled correctly. South Carolina coach Dawn Staley and UConn's Gino Auriemma seem to understand this. Neither has downplayed Clark's impact. Even as they focused on their own team's success, they recognize that a rising tide can lift all boats without diminishing their own achievements. As for ESPN's creative accounting with the viewership numbers, it's worth noting that this approach ultimately benefits no one. It creates distrust among viewers, puts the network on the defensive, and distracts from the actual basketball being played. Transparency would serve everyone better. Yes, ratings dropped significantly without Clark, but they're still higher than pre-Clark levels, indicating lasting growth. The championship game between UConn and South Carolina will provide another interesting data point in this ongoing story. It will certainly outperform the semifinals. Championship games always do. But the comparison to last year's Clark-fueled final will be unavoidable. ESPN might be hoping that Paige Bueckers can generate Clark-like interest, but the semifinals numbers suggest that's not happening yet. Bueckers is an outstanding player with star quality, but the ratings indicate she doesn't currently have Clark's broader appeal beyond core basketball fans. The most telling admission in this whole saga might be ESPN's decision to bring Clark in as a guest commentator for the championship. If they truly believe that women's basketball didn't need Clark to draw viewers, why feature her prominently in a game she's not playing in? Actions speak louder than press releases, and this action acknowledges Clark's unique drawing power. Perhaps the most ironic aspect of this situation is that Clark herself has consistently been the most gracious person in the room. She's never claimed to be bigger than the sport or demanded special treatment. She's praised her peers, respected the game's history, and let her play do the talking. While others debate her impact, she's quietly preparing for her WNBA debut, where she'll face a new set of challenges and expectations. The ratings reality doesn't diminish the accomplishments of UConn, South Carolina, or any other team in this tournament. They're playing excellent basketball worthy of attention and respect. But pretending that Clark's absence hasn't affected viewership doesn't serve these teams or the sport. It just creates a credibility gap that undermines legitimate coverage. As women's basketball moves forward, it would benefit from embracing the full truth. Clark changed the game, brought unprecedented attention, and created new opportunities for growth. Her absence is felt in the ratings, but her impact continues to elevate the sport's baseline popularity. Both realities can be acknowledged without contradiction. The Final Four ratings don't lie. Even if ESPN's framing attempts to obscure the truth, 10 million viewers didn't show up this year who were there last year. That's not a minor fluctuation. It's a seismic shift that correlates directly with one player's absence. Acknowledging this doesn't diminish women's basketball. It simply recognizes Clark's extraordinary impact on the sport's popularity. For Diana Taurasi and others who question whether Clark could transition successfully to the pro game, the ratings drop might prompt some reconsideration. If Clark can bring even a fraction of her college audience to the WNBA, she'll be the most valuable player in the league from a business perspective before she plays a single professional minute. Reality is indeed coming, just not the reality some expected. Well, there you have it. 10 million viewers apparently had something better to do without Caitlin Clark in the Final Four. ESPN's creative math can't hide that 71% ratings collapse. And now even Diana Taurasi is suddenly Clark's biggest fan on TV. Who needs reality checks when you've got ratings checks?